Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on planet Earth, which is wrapped in layers of turbulence of all kinds, geopolitical, climatic, and in the United States, political and cultural. Here we are on a Friday afternoon with yet more pretty devastating news for the science community, which we all rely on deeply, even though it's mostly invisible during the course of a particular day. There was an announcement today, like one of those little things that pops up on websites, that for 99% of us, including me, really, until a meteorologist pinged me, doesn't really have any particular meaning. Due to the current gap in continued funding from the U.S. National Science Foundation, the UNIDATA Program Center has temporarily paused most operations. Okay, so I got an email from Anton Seaman, who's a meteorologist and a scientist in the Hudson Valley where I used to live, and who I've met, who's worked all over the world, and he sent some pretty concerning thoughts about this. And he mentioned Jim Steenburgh, who's at University of Utah. He's a professor of atmospheric sciences there, as someone who could walk through what this is. And what we're talking about is one tiny facet of this multi-dimensional monster of the defunding that's happening right now. And not just defunding, but agency firings that are devastating the sort of the functional systems that help science work, and not just help science work, but help forecasters, including commercial ones, tell you what's going to happen next week, or if there's a tornado warning. I've done multiple sessions on these issues. So, Jim, though, if you looked at the human science enterprise as kind of a neurophysiological system, it's what part of the system is UNIDATA? Is it circulatory? Is it neural? Tell us a little bit about, just walk us through.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of everything. I mean, UNIDATA is a group that develops the underpinnings of everything we do to share weather data, to analyze it, to process it, and plot it. I mean, if you're looking at products on your smartphone or on your computer, there's a very, very high probability that some component of the software, it may be essential for producing that. And they've been involved in this now for 40 years. And so, absolutely critical. I mean, things that we take for granted today, for example, looking at radar on your smartphone, UNIDATA was the group that galvanized the community and developed the key software so that the data could flow from National Service, Weather Service radars all over the internet and allow people to use and process it. That's just one example. So super important organization for weather education and for sharing weather data.
Yeah, and yeah, I'm looking here on another part of the website, which is still up and running, sort of, and it describes the viewing capacity. So it's not just the data.
It's not just the data. It's the data sharing, but it's also graphics. Really important for meteorological education, for example. So most atmospheric sciences or meteorology programs, and even Earth systems or Earth sciences departments oftentimes use UNIDATA products. In this case, what you're looking at is a loop from the integrated data viewer. That's an interactive data viewer that they developed. A lot of places use those in the classrooms. So they're absolutely important for meteorological education.
Yeah. And then, of course, that education spills out into as people leave academia and they work at either in the private or public sector.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to bet that almost any company that's meteorological or a meteorological company is using UNIDATA software in-house. So UNIDATA, for example, has a product called MetPy. This is like Python-based, software that almost anybody who does meteorological analysis uses. I just happened to notice a post from Dr. Jeff Masters on Blue Sky. He co-founded Weather Underground, and he said, without UNIDATA, the company I co-founded, Weather Underground, would never have come to be. And,
Wow.
and that shows the impact of UNIDATA beyond the academic community.
Right, and that in other words, it leads to innovations and capacities. And I'm actually looking for his post. I could show it. Well, we'll find it later. Yeah, so that and that became a big thing, his company, and so many other aspects now with how people get their weather information. Clearly, as you were just saying, derived from this.
Yeah, in the 1980s, there was a company. It was called BASF. They had an advertisement said, "We don't make the products you buy, we make the products you buy better." And I used to think that was actually a good description for UNIDATA, because they're doing all the little things that people take for granted that you don't see behind the scenes, that enables all the cool stuff that we like to use to look at weather. And there's
Yeah,
another.
here's a post from Zach Labe, who's a great data visualizer, actually, who got laid off, fired by the government. Who I got to know when he was doing all his great social media visualizations of sea ice data and the like, when he was still at Irvine. But he's making the point, the hits keep coming. And let's back off from the specifics of UNIDATA for a second and talk about the hits keep coming. Just describe, first of all, let's back up to your experience. You're an atmospheric sciences professor. You've been at University of Utah for a long time. And you were part of this UNIDATA ecosystem early on. So just talk through a little bit of that and then get to what your community is sharing these days. What were you feeling? And
Yeah, I mean, my view is I've been a professor for 30 years, and I started graduate school before that, and really my career kind of has paralleled UNIDATA because they've been around for about 40 years, and there's really nothing that no aspect of my career that has not benefited from developments of UNIDATA. The modeling that I do has benefited from the availability of data that their software has enabled. I probably use UNIDATA products every day that I come here to the office. We use it for our software. It's just super important. And they just do all those things that no university on its own can do. I mean, there are things that we have to do as a community and from a community perspective, and UNIDATA does a lot of that. Originally, what they got developed, the reason to develop UNIDATA back in the 80s was, this was in the nascent era stages of the internet. You could not look, for example, very easily at satellite imagery, certainly couldn't look at computer model output for forecasting, things that we take for granted today, radar data at universities, and we wanted to put that into the classroom. And so that really got the UNIDATA built the so-called cyber infrastructure, everything that needs to be done for universities to access that data and do it in real time and do it in a way that we can allow students to forecast the weather. And then, of course, now they just continue to push the envelope on what can be done, and it's just super valuable. It's had a big impact on my career and probably everybody in the atmospheric sciences.
in a way, it sounds like the kind of thing that a company would have developed initially. But what makes it? What's the role of government here? And the NSF.
Well, I don't think a company would have developed it back then. I mean, the local data manager, for example, that UNIDATA developed, which is now used by many private sector companies, that was something that didn't exist. There probably wasn't maybe a commercialization ability for it at the time. It's just one of those things. There are aspects of what the government funds that fill gaps that maybe the private sector can't do, or it's, far enough out there that, I can remember it. This was a long time ago, maybe about 20 years ago. The LDM was pushing was in like the top 5 amount of data that was being pushed through the internet at one time. It was enormous volumes of data because, weather data is extremely voluminous, satellite data, computer model output, everything else. So software that could manage this is really pretty valuable. And UNIDATA, that's one of their biggest contributions. The local data manager is a software package that's been around now for almost 40 years with updates, of course.
And let's talk about, you must know people who are directly involved whose jobs are also stopped or done or cut because of what's going on. They're part of that infrastructure as well. It's not just
yeah, definitely. I mean,
not just programming.
It's got to be very challenging. I think there's a couple things. One is, of course, the human element. Anytime somebody loses a job, certainly that was one of the first things I thought of were my friends that worked there. But also just these disruptions and the loss potentially of intellectual capital, people that have been working on these for a long time and now might be considering maybe other job opportunities or whatever. My impression at UNIDATA is, you have people that are really passionate about this, especially about education and meteorological education. Most people that work there tend to stay there for a long time. And there's a lot of value to that. And I think this is going to, potentially scare some people out of the business, unfortunately.
Yeah, and then this gets back to what we were talking about earlier with your work on campuses and with students. Students are always making decisions about what to focus on. Especially undergrads are trying to figure out where to put their lives, and seeing this kind of disruption and uncertainty. That's one question. How are you seeing this play out in your classrooms in terms of people wondering whether they should go into the sciences? And I have a second.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's definitely a lot of anxiety right now amongst our students. It's a function too of their private sector employment in meteorology is growing pretty fast, which is a real positive. But you're going to have a short-term period in which I think we're going to see a lot of people trying to move from the academic and the government sectors into the private sector. So students are quite concerned about, employment. And I just had a conversation with one of my graduate students today who's thinking about finishing up the next 15 months and what all this might mean for their future employment and how they might want to adapt their PhD plans to have a broader employment possibilities when they're finished. So yeah, this is all definitely affecting universities.
Unbelievable. Hold on one second. I'm just doing one thing here. And are you tracking the wider issues? Obviously this is one, as I said, one facet of this multidimensional science enterprise in America. And there's not just the NSF cuts, but agency cuts and the like are really beginning to play out. It feels like it's still just the early days of this too, after the initial DOGE demolition derby. What around the landscape outside of this UNIDATA portal makes you worried as a scientist and as a citizen? Yeah,
I don't know where this is all going. My crystal ball is not very good outside of maybe meteorology, but obviously we're all pretty concerned. Science requires sustained investment. This is the biggest disruption that I can remember in my career, probably since really the NSF really got going after World War II. It's not something that I saw coming. And I don't know. I mean, a lot of what we do as scientists, these disruptions are very hard. It's going to take a long time to recover. Reductions in indirect costs, for example, have real big impacts at universities. I mean, people have lost funding. So I don't know where it's all going. I wish I could give you more information on that, except it's something I think about every day when I come into the office and about where this is all going to go.
The second question. Sorry.
I think in atmospheric sciences, those of us who work in weather forecasting, there's been no breakthrough, like the aha moment where all of a sudden weather prediction got better. What we've seen is sustained investment over decades has put us to a point now where forecasts really have an impact, a high quality impact. And so what concerns me about this, where we're headed now, is we're going to see a abrupt drop off of that in the United States. And that's going to have real impacts on people. It's not just a function of science, but it's, we still have tremendous ability to improve weather forecasts moving forward. Moving to more kind of AI or machine learning based forecast systems now is looking like a really exciting proposition. And that's going to slow down. And so that's a concern that I have, just for the benefit of the nation and its residents.
Yeah, and I just hosted a discussion a few days ago with Joe Friday, who was the National Weather Service director from the late 80s through the late 90s, and with Mike Smith, who's a private meteorologist, and with Alan Gerard, who was at NOAA and National Weather Service for a very long time. And Mike Smith in the private sector was pointing to the fact that, some of the key systems we rely on for weather preparedness were already degrading.
Yeah.
The tornado, he's been a strong voice warning about degraded tornado warning outcomes. It's not just the technology, it's training and other issues. And that was even before this Trump hit. And now Mike is very conservative politically. He's actually a Trump supporter, but he's freaking out about how this is taking us backwards. And here, of course, we are in the sort of Maxim, the key tornado going into hurricane season too.
We use this word weather enterprise to describe everything that's happening in meteorology, right? That's private sector, private companies, NOAA, the National Weather Service, academia. We all work together. And the one thing that has surprised me through all this is everybody's kind of in agreement that none of this is good. It's not a good investment. What's happening right now is not good for weather in the country, regardless of what sector that you're from. And I just look at it as a lost opportunity. I kind of look at what the government spends on weather as a good investment, because ultimately weather affects a huge fraction of the U.S. economy. And it's just we're now seeing lost opportunities and real damage, I think, to the weather enterprise.
Well, I'm showing folks you have a blog, and I'm going to be reposting this on Sustain What. What is the best thing that the average person can do to make a difference here? A lot of this feels unstoppable in many ways. Certain sector of Congress is sitting on their hands or in their foxhole. And so what do people do?
Yeah, as an academic, I sometimes feel frustrated. I'm writing to my congressional representatives, for example, and trying to tell my story. I try to write letters that are a little more personal because I come directly from this field. I've always been a big fan of scientific outreach and trying to communicate science, which is why I have this blog, Wasatch Weather Weenies. It's very focused on snowfall and mountain weather. That's kind of the avenue that I pursue. And I don't know, I just think overall it's a tough time, but I wish I had a magic bullet, but it's like I'm thinking, just continue to reach out to your representatives and spread the word.
That certainly feels key. When we're done here, people can share the link to our conversation to amplify some of the points they hope to make. There was one other thing I was going to ask you. It's about one big aspect of this. It's a little different than what we're talking about. I was just looking for the right link here. It's about regions in the country, all around the country. There are not just universities, but there are agencies and organizations that work on science, including weather science, water flows. For example, the U.S. Geological Survey has centers all around the country, and a lot of those budgets are being slammed now too. So it gets even at your local. If you're thinking about your local economy and your culture, if you're in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, or in Los Alamos, obviously New Mexico, or Asheville, North Carolina. Oh, here it is. Yeah, Julio Betancourt, who's a Geological Survey scientist, said all these water science centers are being cut, or at least their budgets are frozen, and they're in Alaska. They're all over the country: Kansas, Nebraska, Ohio, the Upper Midwest, etc. So this will have this other effect on people's lives and livelihoods, depending, just in terms of if you live in this kind of area.
I like to tell my students that water is the agent that delivers weather and climate impacts. Most of the stuff problematic, like floods, drought, wildfires, all these things are ultimately related to the water cycle, the runoff, everything else. So, what we do as meteorologists is very interdisciplinary. For example, a heavy rainfall event or landfalling hurricane. It's not just the hurricane and the winds. The water is what kills most people and does most of the damage. Right. So water is a really critical thing. And this is going to have an impact on that as well. Fisheries is another example. So a lot of stuff that we have taken for granted now for decades is kind of on the chopping block.
Well, I hope that the push can come to get some folks in Congress to get off their hands, stop sitting on their hands, and to recognize that this sort of wrecking ball approach to budgets it's so distinct from the tradition of working it through the congressional committees and with input on what makes for a sensible efficiency move and what's dangerous. Without that, we're really in trouble. Well, I appreciate your coming on briefly for this conversation, and Jim Steenburgh at University of Utah, and hopefully it'll get folks to look beyond the acronym UNIDATA and dive in and sort of understand that science is a system. It's got people and technology connected, and that's how we drive progress. And if you erode that, it's kind of a death of a thousand cuts in so many ways. And hopefully they're reversible. If we get climate may or may not have tipping points. On long time scales, it does. But our technology, our capacity to get ahead of storms and to understand the dynamics of our system, definitely you could get to a breaking point here. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Hold on one second.